It's good to be back. September, I love September, starting things new. It's great to be back from the sort of, summer's nice, but it's not scheduled, or it's always changing as you're going. And so it's nice to be back in a routine. I wanted to say a big thank you to all those who have filled the pulpit while I was away. And I think it's always nice to have, for the minister to go away and have other voices leading worship from time to time, so that you don't get too bored of me. This fall, we're going to be picking up where we left off in June, and I've got a slide here, if we can have that first slide there. Yeah, so in June, we were reading through the book Life After Doom, Wisdom and Courage for a World Falling Apart. And don't worry if you weren't there, we're starting a whole new section here. But if you remember, we've been taking this little trip around the U theory of change. And back in January, we started with letting go, the path of descent. And then through the spring, we went through this place of insight, which we called letting be. And today, we are taking further turn around the U to walk what McLaren calls the path of resilience, letting come. And as I was thinking about resilience, I was thinking back to when my kids were both in elementary school. I volunteered on the school council, and after a few years, I became chair of the school council. And I did that for 3 years. And the parents really liked it when I was chair because I could keep our meetings to a tight 60 minutes. But it comes from being a Presbyterian. We like keeping our meetings short. But during my time as chair, there was this buzzword that we kept coming back and talking about. And that word was resilience. And the question on our minds, the minds of the parents and the minds of the teachers, was how can we build resilience in our students? And so this school council, we offered workshops, and we got resources for parents, and we brought in experts with the latest data on resilience, all because there was this unspoken assumption that our kids would need to be resilient to face the world that they were growing up in. And what I've come to discover in reflecting on that is the truth. It wasn't just the kids that needed to become more resilient. All of us, adults included, needed to grow, to change, and adapt to an ever-changing world. And man, has our world been changing in the last 10 years since I was chair of the school council. There's been a lot that we've had to adapt to, especially the church has had to adapt to. But the problem that we face is that we don't like change. Nobody likes change, they say, except for babies. But the common misconception that we have is that once we become adults, there's no more growing to do. That's why we call ourselves grown-ups. We've already grown up. We've done that part. And as much as that is a problem today, an issue today, it seems to me that that was also an issue for the disciples. And Jesus saw that as disciples, that they felt that maybe they were all done growing up, all done learning. And so Jesus said things to them like, you need to be born again. And what we read today, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And in those teachings, Jesus is inviting his disciples. Jesus, who they called him rabbi, teacher, was inviting his disciples to humble themselves and to recognize that the kingdom of heaven is not this destination that once you get there, you're done, but rather the kingdom of heaven is a journey of growth and a journey of change. And so this is what Brian McLaren advocates in his book, and specifically in the chapter which he entitled, "When Life Gets Tough, We Get Tougher." And he also adds, "and eat ice cream." But when he says that we get tougher, what he means by tougher is capable of meeting deteriorating conditions with increasing capacities. I'll say that again. When he means tougher, he means capable of meeting deteriorating conditions with increasing capacities. And I think you can likely imagine what some of those deteriorating conditions might be. We see it all the time in the news. And so in his chapter, When Life Gets Tough, We Get Tougher, he outlines 7 ways that we will need to get tough, 7 ways that we will need to adapt or be more resilient in this world falling apart. And instead of just sharing those 7 things with you, naming them one by one this morning, I wanted to instead illustrate them with a story. I'm going to tell you a story about a person who also had to adapt to a world falling apart. And it is the story of Joseph from the book of Genesis. Joseph was one of 12 sons. Their father was Jacob, also known as Israel. That's where we get the tribes of Israel, the people of Israel. Jacob had 12 sons. And as far as Joseph's brothers were concerned, Joseph was the privileged one. He had a privileged life. He was the favored son of his father, and as a result, he was treated differently than the other brothers. And one example of that in the story is that his father gives him this special coat of many colors. Maybe you've heard of Joseph and the Technicolor dream coat. Jacob gives his son Joseph this coat to demonstrate how special Joseph was. Now, that's one thing. It's one thing to be the favored one in the family. It's another thing to gloat about being the favored one in the family. And Joseph also thought that he was special too. He would have these dreams about things that he would interpret in a way that made him special, above his brothers, even above his parents. Dreams that he knew in his heart would come true. But here's where Joseph was not very wise, at least not yet in the story. Because if Joseph was wise, he would have realized that telling his brothers just how special he was would end up alienating them, and things maybe wouldn't turn out well. So, that is what happened. Things did not turn out well. His brothers ended up selling him to slave traders, and they faked his death so no one would ever come looking for him again. Kind of extreme, but this is how Joseph's journey begins. And that brings us to the first way that Daniel has to get tough. He's no longer the favored one. As a slave, he had to learn how to adapt to his new circumstances. He had to be agile in a way for whatever life was going to throw at him, because life was changing and quickly. And that even meant him letting go. It would have been easy for him to just continually lament about his old life and wanting to go back there, but he had to let things go of how they used to be. And so as a slave, he ended up serving in the house of one of Pharaoh's officials, whose name was Potiphar. And Joseph did well because he learned to adapt. And soon he became the head servant of Potiphar's household. And he quickly adapted to his circumstances, and he thrived there, at least for a little bit. Sadly, that didn't last for long. Soon Joseph was faced with another way that he would have to get tough. He was faced with a moral choice. Potiphar's wife had her eye on Joseph. He was a handsome guy, after all, and her advances would not be denied. So what would Joseph do? Well, he had to get tough in his character. So rather than betraying his principles, Joseph showed a toughness in his character and chose to do the right thing. Of course, choosing to do the right thing in an unjust world has its consequences. And Potiphar's wife ended up lying to her husband and got Joseph in trouble. And Potiphar put him in prison. And so despite this tragedy of justice, Joseph grew in a strength of character, and his ability to adapt to ever-changing circumstances allowed him to succeed in his new circumstances in prison. So Joseph found favor again with the chief guard at the prison. And because he was trustworthy, the chief guard put him in charge of all the prisoners that were there. But again, Joseph would have to get tough. Prisoners would share their dreams with Joseph, and he would interpret them for him. But sometimes the interpretation would be something good, and sometimes the interpretation would be something bad. And Joseph would have to toughen up and say things that people didn't want to hear. And so he was so good at this interpreting of dreams that news of this got to all the way to Pharaoh. And when Pharaoh had a dream that frightened him, a dream that none of his advisors could interpret, Joseph was called before Pharaoh to give Pharaoh this bad news because it wasn't a good dream. And so you can imagine how frightened Joseph would have been by such a task. But Joseph summoned up the courage and told Pharaoh what his dream meant, speaking truth to the powers that be that were hard to hear. The dream that Pharaoh had was a forecast from God, telling Pharaoh that there was going to be 7 years of plentiful crops followed by 7 years of famine. And because Joseph was adaptive and had strong character and was courageous, Pharaoh knew that Joseph was the one to lead Egypt through this coming crisis. So Joseph is put in charge again and promoted to second command over all of Egypt. But now Joseph had another way that he needed to toughen up. Because bringing all of Egypt together for this massive effort of storing food for a future date was going to take everyone working together to survive the 7 years of famine. And so Joseph was going to need to grow in his ability to see the interdependence of one another, and not just Egypt's interdependence, but the surrounding nations. They would all need to come together in this unity to survive. And Joseph is the one who brings them together. The famine did not just impact Egypt, but it also impacted Joseph's homeland. And this is like a funny turn of events in the story. This is what brings Joseph's brothers back into the picture. Joseph probably could never have imagined the day that his brothers would come before him and beg him for food for their family. You know, he had changed so much in the last number of years that when his brothers came asking for food from Pharaoh, they didn't even recognize Joseph, their brother. The lives of his brothers were in Joseph's hands. And again, Joseph would have to toughen up. He'd need to grow in wisdom. Because how was he going to decide what to do with his brothers? Was he going to deny them food? Was he going to put them in prison? Sell them as slaves like they had done to him? He was going to, instead of doing any of that, he was going to put them to the test to see if they were the same brothers who had sold him into slavery all those years ago. And just like Joseph had grown in wisdom, he wondered, maybe they too have grown and changed and adapted. And so when he saw that they had indeed changed through these tests that he put them through, he could no longer help but tell them who he really was. And that brings us to this second last way that Joseph toughened up. I also can't imagine what it would have felt like to have your family betray you like Joseph's brothers did to Joseph. And it seems even more impossible beyond that to imagine forgiving them, showing them compassion. But that's exactly what Joseph does. Joseph grew in his capacity for compassion, and with tears in his eyes, he revealed to his brother who he was, and he embraced them as family, and they were reunited. And you'd think that was the end of the story. But Joseph's brothers and father and their families, they all come and settle in Egypt where there is food, and Joseph saves all of them. And then one day, Joseph's father dies. And the brothers, even though Joseph had shown them compassion, they were still a little nervous that Joseph might, hold a grudge. But rather than getting revenge, Joseph says to them all, "You meant this for evil, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." And so with that bit of wisdom, Joseph demonstrates one last way that he had to toughen up, which was his spirit. Through the whole story, Joseph is aware that it's not just him who's making all these things work out for him. He was toughening up in all these different ways, but it was God, the whole way along, who had given him favor with Potiphar, favor with the chief guard, favor with Pharaoh. And it was that growing trust in God that strengthened him through the challenges and the afflictions that he had faced. So Joseph's resilience is really a result of his growing spirit and his faith in God. And that is the story of Joseph. And those are the 7 ways that Brian McLaren invites us to toughen up in a world falling apart. And, we can learn a lot from the ancestors of our faith. And from the story of Joseph, we can see that in deteriorating circumstances, as was the case with him, we can increase our capacity for adapting and change. We can strengthen our character. We can summon courage, grow in wisdom, strengthen our character, come together in unity, and be filled with compassion, overflowing with God's Spirit. Joseph's story reminds us of what we read already this morning from Paul, writing to a church who is struggling, when he said, "But we also boast in our afflictions, knowing that affliction produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us." And so when I think back to the initial question of how do we build resilience in kids and also ourselves, the first place that I would start in building resilience with kids is to tell the stories of our faith. Stories that remind us that God is always with us. Stories that remind us that there's always room for change and growth. And stories that remind us when life gets tough, we get tougher and eat ice cream. Amen.